If you have questions about city services or need
everybody,
aware,
excited to see you all, and we've got a busy agenda today. So I know we're going to have some folks sign on a little bit later. So I want to be mindful of everybody's time and get going. So what I definitely want to do is number one, I guess I'm officially calling this meeting of the Columbia Affordable Housing Task Force to order. And I know we're going to hear from Dr. Grady a little bit later in his presentation, but as our newest member of the committee, I just wanted to give him an opportunity to introduce himself. So Brian, can you unmute quickly and introduce yourself to everyone?
Sure. So my name is Brian Grady. I'm the Chief Research Officer at SC Housing, which is the state housing authority. Been in that position for about a year and a half. Worked in affordable housing up in Ohio previous to that. Also resident of Columbia, live in Cottontown, and also a member of the Richland County Planning Commission. So glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. We're glad to have you. Brian is our only new member this week. So I think we're good on our committee makeup. So I want to make sure after today's meeting, I'm going to confirm with everybody the committees. I've communicated with all the committee chairs so on who has signed up, but I think we have one or two people who have not signed up. So I'll make sure I do that. I'm trying to note everybody that's here, and I think I've got everybody. Let me just make sure I'm not missing. I don't see John Ando, Jeff Armstrong, Tanya Isaac, Jeff Larimore, or Mary Louise Rach, and I know Lala Anna's going to be late. Am I missing? Is there somebody I say I'm missing that you are here?
Tamika, hey, this is Susan McPherson with the Chamber. I'm here. I'm using another iPad. So I'm under this iPad. Good morning.
Thank you, Susan.
Morning.
Anybody else? Okay. All right, so some other folks might come on. Okay, so all of you guys, just briefly, you should have already, through your materials that you received, should have received a copy of our minutes from our first two meetings, June 9th and June 14th. And so hopefully you had an opportunity to see those and review them. And if you have, I will at this point entertain a motion to approve the minutes for June 9th and June 14th.
So moved.
Okay, who was that? That was Jim?
That was me.
Okay, it's been moved by Jim. Is there a second?
Reggie.
Reggie, second. Okay, all those in favor of approval of the minutes from June 9th and June 9th and July 14th, say aye or raise your hand. I know all of you are kind of muted.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Aye.
Great, thank you. So we have those approved. So I want to jump in because I really want to make sure that we have an opportunity not just to see these great presentations, but to allow for some questions. I'm super excited, guys. I sent you guys last night the bios for Mike and Lauren. So I'm not going to read their bios, but I will just say that Mike Wallace and Lauren Lowry work with the National League of Cities. All of you know that I'm very active in the National League of Cities. I currently serve on the board, but has been certainly an opportunity for me to expand my professional development as an elected official, being connected with this amazing organization and colleagues from throughout the country to learn best practices. And so right before the pandemic started, in March was our Congressional Cities Conference. And let me go back from the Congressional Cities Conference. Last year's president was the former mayor of Gary, Indiana, Karen Freeman Wilson. And Karen's issue, as a lot of times when you have a leader who has a year, they pick a topic. And so affordable housing and access to housing was Karen's topic for the year. And so what she asked the staff and the professionals at NLC to do was to do some research and come up with a report. The report is also included in what I sent you guys last night, a homeward bound report that they presented in the last fall. at our fall conference, and I was very impressed with it then. It was amazing report. And then in March, right before the pandemic, I was at National Good Cities at our Congressional Cities Conference, and there were a lot of presentations that talked about some of the data in this report and just access to affordable housing throughout the country. And so as we were getting ready for this meeting, I was rereading the report, looking at some of their recommendations, and I just felt like that was a great opportunity, a presentation that we all needed to hear for everything that we do individually and as we're going to do as this task force. So I reached out to Clarence Anthony, the president of NLC. Those of you who get my early morning, late night emails, you know me. So I think I sent him either a very early morning or very late night email. But within the next day, he immediately responded and connected with me with Mike and Lauren, who did this research and said, this is who you need to come. And so, and with very, very short notice, I think 3 days notice, the two of them said, yes, we'd like to be here and make a presentation. So with that said, I'm going to introduce Mike and Lauren to make a presentation to us on the study that NLC, a report NLC did, and particularly some recommendations and some best practices. So Mike, I'm just gonna go ahead and click it to you. Welcome, thank you. This is the City of Columbia. If I'm biased, probably the best task force anywhere in this country because this is a lot of knowledge here. But thank you and welcome, and we appreciate you guys being here.
Great, thank you. Make sure, can everyone hear me right now? I'm good. Okay, great. Well, thank you for giving us time to talk about our research. I'm really impressed with the members of your task force, that you've really reached deep into the community and make sure that many different points of view are represented. We think, that's of course necessary to any successful effort. I'm gonna try to share my screen here up this report. And let's see, can everyone see the report now? The PowerPoint? Great. Yeah, so exactly, Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson, Gary, Indiana, charged NLC with coming up with really a better, more updated set of housing recommendations that local officials and federal officials could take up rather quickly. Gary, of course, was a city, what we call a legacy city, that had amongst their challenges, housing was one of the big ones. Of course, their challenge there was lots of vacant housing, but still had the same, effect that there was a mismatch between residents who needed housing and the housing that was available. So what we did was put together a task force of local officials. You'll see the members of the task force there. We tried to make it representative of both parties. So you'll see Republicans and Democrats, large cities, small towns, rural areas, first tier suburbs, sort of every kind of housing market we could think of to have representation on the task force to see if we could find consensus on a set of policies that we thought residents could embrace at the local level and that federal decision makers could also come to embrace regardless of party. So really the key things for us when we sort of looked out at why housing was important to local governments, for the longest time, I think local governments saw housing primarily as a means for maintaining property tax revenue, and certainly that is important. But the challenge there is that when you're looking at it just through that lens, there's a tendency to erect some walls and protect the higher value housing. That starts getting enshrined in different kinds of policies. It makes it harder for other residents to gain access, right? And really, we saw that stable housing is a prerequisite, but you have to have stable housing for residents to engage in economic mobility, kinds of activities for job security and for health and well-being. The data is very clear that housing is a social determinant of health, and the more unstable your housing situation is, the more likely you're going to experience the kinds of sicknesses that keep you out of work or keep kids out of school. So it's just sort of cascades. When there's housing instability, it's very hard to engage in the kind of activities that put residents on a sound fiscal path. So our platform calls for housing for all. And we, have also seen that America's attitudes and biases about housing are changing. I think, with the Black Lives Movement, I think it's probably changed even more since we've released this report, that residents are becoming more aware of the kinds of obstacles that racial minorities have had to access housing, the roles of municipal governments. One of the things we had to do, of course, to be credible in this space was to acknowledge the role of municipal governments in erecting walls and making it harder for people of color to get housing through participating in policies like redlining. You can layer maps today and see that neighborhoods that were redlined redlined out of being able to purchase a house, those neighborhoods are the ones that are still suffering lower measures of education, lower measures of jobs earnings, and you can see that that people don't live as long in those areas just because of their zip code. So it's important, we think, for residents to understand the past and how the city got to where it is, and how cities across the nation got to where they are, so they can embrace the kind of changes that are necessary to invite more and different kinds of housing for all residents across your city. And so, Lauren will talk more depth about specific local measures, but we did cast our gaze out to different cities that are innovating. And one of those, of course, is ending detached housing zones in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So Minneapolis ended its zoning for single-family detached housing. That's not to say they've outlawed the construction of single-family detached homes, but no longer in their city can that be the only kind of housing available. So they've made it easier for ADUs to be built, for doubles and duplexes, those sorts of things to be built. We sort of see that, when it comes to affordable housing, the variety of housing is important, different kinds of housing. We don't want to be solely reliant on things like low-income housing tax credits that build, hundreds of units all in one place. I think, what we're calling for is for a greater variety of kinds of housing units in every kind of neighborhood that invite people who would be, concentrated in neighborhoods with high poverty to be able to get access to the kinds of services that are in some higher performing neighborhoods. Of course, you can't do it alone. Housing is too big of an issue for any one city to take on its own. The problem is that federal programs are inadequate and ill-suited to the different kind of housing markets that we have today. Really, we have the Section 8 housing voucher program, the home program at CDBG. All of these are serially underfunded. In fact, housing assistance is sort of a lottery in this country. Only 1 out of every 4 eligible residents for housing subsidies actually gets it. So lots of Americans are spending way too much of their income on housing, unless they're lucky enough to get a federal subsidy to bring that back down to a more reasonable level. So local governments can't do it alone, but at the same time, local governments cannot wait for the federal government to solve the problem. We have to keep advocating for better housing supports. This is just a map, and I think Lauren will talk more about this kind of thing later, but just to show you the different kinds of markets that NLC's identified. There's other ways to identify markets too, but we have a report in addition to the one we're talking about today that shows how different cities can be characterized, whether they're a growing city, a rent burdened city, a transit desiring city. It's really an effort to help cities find other cities that look like themselves across the country and figure out if there are some common solutions to their housing challenges. At the federal level, here's the real question for local governments to be able to get more federal aid for housing. Is the local government going to be viewed as the problem or the solution to the housing crisis? So you'll see at the federal level, there is a debate about whether local codes, local zoning, other things like this are barriers, hookup fees, these sorts of things, where those are barriers to more affordable housing, or are local governments going to do more to encourage the construction of housing that's affordable to their lower income residents? In our view, the federal government's not going to send additional funds down if they don't think the local government is going to be part of the solution. And so it's very helpful to see groups like your Housing Task Force come together that we can then surface for federal lawmakers to show that local governments indeed are thinking about these things. We have 5 recommendations for federal policy and 5 recommendations for local policy. This is new for NLC. Mostly we've concentrated on federal policy, but with this report, we see that federal, state, and local policies on housing have to be in sync to maximize the scarce dollars we have to create affordable housing. So our recommendations to the federal level is to stabilize and stem the loss of public and affordable housing. Public housing is right now an asset and naturally occurring affordable housing. Both are assets that are being lost at a bad rate. Public housing in particular has a huge backlog of maintenance needs. I'm not sure if there's public housing in South Carolina or in Columbia. I should have looked it up. But it's very important to preserve that, because public housing really is the largest source of permanently affordable housing across the country. With every loss of a public housing unit, that's a loss of a unit that was permanently affordable for residents of your city. And so we think the federal government should recommit to the preservation of public housing. We call them to pass a long-term standalone federal housing bill. The transportation, Congress deals with transportation this way. Every 3 or 4 years, they pass a transportation bill. It gives them a chance to reassess the transportation needs of our country. There's no similar thing for housing. There's no reason for Congress to every couple of years reassess the condition of housing in the country, how it's financed, who's getting it. And we think that would be a good step for the federal government to take. We are calling on for Congress to support innovation and modernization of land use and planning at the local and regional level. This really, I want to focus on the regional level here. The regional councils across the country, or the metropolitan planning organizations across the country, are able to help local governments with their housing needs in a variety of different ways. And we know from our studies that some of the most wasted resources in terms of housing potential are on the margins between municipalities, where jurisdictions overlap. Because when you're thinking about just your city, your thinking oftentimes tends to end at the boundaries, right? But it is really important to talk to your neighboring jurisdictions, thinking about housing in a regional way, so that both all the communities in your region are carrying their fair share of affordable housing. And that can be a really hard conversation to have without thinking about how to talk about it ahead of time, but also making sure that people are being housed in places where they can reach jobs, right? Or where they can reach education opportunities. And oftentimes those jobs can be across jurisdictional bounds. Fixing inequities in housing development and the housing finance system. We know that public policy officially supported racial discrimination in housing for several decades, and we have not taken affirmative steps to fix the outcomes of those bad policies. And we think the federal government has a role in that, and we think the local governments do too. And support scalable innovation and financing for cities, towns, and villages. This is really about providing technical assistance to cities that have fewer resources, right? So smaller communities, cities with fewer municipal employees than sort of the larger metro areas. So those are the federal recommendations. We also settled on 5 local recommendations, and those are establish local programs by combining funding and financing streams to support housing goals. So that's essentially redirecting multiple revenue streams into one pot for housing. modernize local land use policies, including zoning and permitting to rebalance housing supply and demand. I showed you the example from Minnesota. It's quite complicated, the ways that zoning and permitting can work together to exclude people from housing opportunities, even though they're well intentioned. Or they could be just sort of legacy decisions in your zoning that may be holding people back from opportunity. Identify and engage broadly with local stakeholders across municipal boundaries. That's what you all are doing now with the task force. That's really good. Support the needs of distinct subpopulations, including the homeless, seniors, and persons with conviction histories. Of course, we know as the demographics of your city change, that means that the housing needs are probably going to change too. With more seniors, perhaps wanting to downsize or move out of the houses they raise their families in, so those houses can become available to new families. And prioritize equitable outcomes in housing decisions. We sort of have been talking about that too. So those are our recommendations for the local government. Easy to put it in a sentence, not so easy always to carry out. Lots of difficult conversations there. But that's the overview of the report that we put together. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Lauren to talk about the research we've done more recently and how other cities have sort of put these recommendations into practice.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to, can everybody hear me? I'm going to share my screen now. Oh, Mike, can you?
All right, let me figure out how to do that.
Okay.
Oh, here we go. There we go.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Lauren Lowry. I'm the Program Director for Housing and Community Development at National League of Cities. I'm going to provide you a brief overview of our program areas and what we've been up to in the last 8 months. So as you know, my team, we focus on housing, and usually when people think about housing, they just think about the structure and how to get individuals into it. But with my team, we try to really focus on the intersectionality of housing because where you live matters, and there's so much that goes into the outcomes of health as to why housing is important, as well as transportation, justice reform, youth and families, as well as homelessness. Because at the end of the day, where you live matters. So when you think of housing, or at least as my team is thinking about housing and trying to find the best policy solutions to deploy to cities, we want to be very people informed. Like Mike said, there was a task force that was started over 2 years ago. In that time, we produced Homeward Bound. We've also produced local tools to address housing affordability. And this is a good report to read. Because it talks about state preemption, and it talks about potential policy solutions that you may want to consider as you're on this task force, like source of income discrimination, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. It also talks about different solutions, and you can see where South Carolina falls in terms of, is there protection for source of income? Are you allowed to have an affordable housing trust fund? We also have a report that came out, Housing Market Conditions Across America. Mike showed you a slide about that, where we grouped you by your peer cities to give you not only solutions that can work in your particular area, but we also bring in the lens of gender as to how you can assist with distinct populations. Another thing that's interesting about the housing resource that we've been putting out lately, we embed racial equity, because to understand the crises that are happening today, homelessness, housing affordability, housing instability, and evictions, we need to understand the root cause as to how residential segregation has really impacted our communities today, as well as federal and local and state government policies, as well as how private actors have institutionalized some of those practices and why we have the fallout today as it relates to housing. We also, as Mike said, we take in consideration of distinct subpopulation. And I think it's important to pull that out as we're looking for local housing policies, because housing strategies should not be cookie cutter, because when looking at how do we successfully have a person to remain in housing, be it re-entry, be it homelessness, domestic violence, LGBT, it's great to get an understanding as to how we can support these populations to be successful, and that we're not just throwing out solutions. Another thing that we do is, which is critically important, and we take this from local governments in the sense of when building out policies or suggesting out policies, how can we engage the community, but also co-develop with the community as well. So a lot of the policies that are coming out of NLC have these critical focuses. Moving on to the priorities that we've been focusing on, this year is leading together the 2020 cities agenda. So we've been steadily working on releasing policies and resources that can help cities to end housing instability and homelessness. In the last 18 months, we've released an overview of homelessness for local elected leaders. And with this particular one, we wanted to really focus on the root cause of why homelessness occurs, focusing on why homelessness occurred, where homelessness occurred, and what cities should begin to consider as they're thinking about their homeless policy. We also have another policy brief that will be released this month called City Housing Spending on the Rise and How Much Intergovernmental Aid is Helping. So this plays into state and federal government and how much money is actually needed for cities to successfully plan for affordable housing development. In this research, it says that there is over a $14 billion gap for every $100 of intergovernmental aids. Cities will need to put in an additional $3 to support their residents. We also have three reports actually coming out this year, one with Grounded Solution Network on community land trust. And this one is talking to cities about creating lasting affordability for residents, so that, not after a 30-year period of time that the housing remains affordable, but off of a 99-year lease, how housing can remain permanently affordable. And then we also have a report coming out on worker cooperatives talking about creating better jobs, building local wealth. And then going deeper into homelessness, we're really going to talk about the faces of homelessness, financial interventions that can be put into place as well. Also, what's offered in my shop at NLC is that we're partnering with the Center for Community Progress, where we're going to implement a vacant property leadership institute, where we really will dive into abandoned and vacant properties and how cities can begin to put it on the tax roll, but also create thriving communities. So please be on the lookout for that application that will be going out if you're interested. We are also doing a webinar and blog series on community land trusts and worker cooperatives, where we're going to bring in different experts in these fields to really talk about how cities can help support in the development of community land trusts. And that will be happening in September and October. We are also partnering with Stanford Legal Design Lab. We have a cohort of about 5 cities where we've been studying evictions. And what is kind of different from what our intention was with this is, at first we were just going to study eviction, but now with COVID, we're layering in the public health lens to really dive in to help the 5 cities that we've been assisting through this pilot program. In addition to our priority of ending housing instability and homelessness, we have been working really hard on our response to cities to provide them with best practices on the ground. And also having that lens of intersectionality, we've also been focused on how we tackle homelessness and not tackling homelessness in a vacuum. So we've been looking at homelessness in the angle of adults, vehicular homelessness, domestic violence, returning citizens, youth and young adults, and as well as layering a lens of racial equity. We've had webinars beginning since March on supporting homeless individuals, the intersection of justice reform and housing. With COVID, a lot of local jails began to release returning citizens. So how can cities be proactive in assisting them? We've also had a series of articles come out. And I know after this presentation, Mike and I put together a 2-pager where you'll have access to all of these resources. In each of our webinars and blogs, we try to bring city examples where you can look at what your peers are doing in this field and try to bring out emerging trends as well as best practices. As it relates to housing instability, we've been focusing really hard on evictions and housing is health and state preemption, as well as racial equity. We've also tracked over 400 homeless and housing stability policies that have taken place since March. We've also done webinars on the eviction cliff and rental assistance. What's also interesting, we're going to have a session at coming up this Thursday at NLC Virtual Constituency Summit, where we talk about evictions, but leading equitably, where we're going to hear about how cities are putting on a racial equity lens as to really tackle evictions. And like I was saying, rental assistance, talking about landlord mediation, navigating preemption during the time of COVID, and how you can begin to embed racial equity. And we've had policy briefs and fact sheets come out to assist city. We put out a joint guidance with some of our national partners to kind of walk them through the eligibility activities of CDBG, the Coronavirus Fund, and the Emergency Solution Grants, because we want to be able to deploy IDs quickly, because in this time we have to be very quick about helping our communities. And like I said, we have a local action tracker, so you can go in, you can visit nlc.org or covid.nlc.org, and you can see the types of policy solutions across the United States which cities have been putting in. And my name is Lauren, and if you have any questions.
Thank you, Mike and Lauren. So now I wanted to just give us about 10 minutes for some questions. If y'all have any questions regarding their presentations or anything specifically as far as best practices that their research. Like I said, last night I sent y'all guys the full Homeward Bound report. So if y'all could tell, mine is over here, it's pretty lengthy. So I know you didn't get a chance to read it, and they just hit the highlights, but they're certainly in a position to answer any questions. Okay, Jeff?
Thank you for that presentation, Lauren and Mike. When you had the consolidation of the mayors come together and local officials, what were the 3 items that they all kind of consistently stated were the top priorities that they would hope to collectively agree to as a group? So from the standpoint as you have this large consolidation of of individuals with different components throughout the country. If you kind of develop it to a single area, what did they come about saying, we need to concentrate on A first, B first, C first?
Yeah, well, interestingly, public housing was one of those things that that everyone agreed needed a fresh look. That I think because housing agencies are they're not autonomous, but they're not under the direct control of local governments either. That I think there was a unanimous sort of agreement that cities needed to be more involved with their housing authorities and with the structures that the housing authorities governed. So that was one. I think the other was that they recognized that they needed to figure out how to get a greater variety of housing built. So, everybody has developers in their cities, but the developers tend to stick with what they know, right? So they both want to make a profit, but they also, they have the designs that they have and that they're used to. And lots of different emerging technologies, different building materials, 3D printing, there's an opportunity here to probably a better opportunity before COVID. I think that'll make it a little bit harder, but try to figure out how to get different kinds of housing built so that cities get out of a developer rut where they're just relying on the same home builder. And that's difficult too, because I think since the Great Recession, we saw a lot of consolidation in the home building industry, right? So it's the same. And nationally, a handful of builders seem to sort of be dominating the market. And so I guess if there's a third, it was figuring out how to better communicate with landlords, right? With mom and pop landlords, and how to support small developers who want to get involved in the business and meet the needs of the city, and then how to work more closely and consistently with small mom and pop landlords, not necessarily your big management companies. But, in lots of cities, more than half the residential rental units are owned by, other residents, who just own a handful. They're sort of just these little income generating units. But there's, most cities don't even know exactly how many units are like that. There's not necessarily a registry of landlords. So figuring out a way to incent those small landlords to become more actively engaged with the city, and how to incent them to participate in subsidy programs, whether it's a Section 8 program or veterans voucher program, or maybe even a local program. I would say those are the three.
Because the key thing that I wanted to talk about is everybody enjoys to see the brochure quality in new development. Sometimes you got a myriad of challenges to get that underway. So my focus is utilizing the existing properties that may be deemed available for affordable can kind of stay, even within market conditions, inside the affordability rates. The difficulty then becomes the focus could go solely into a small bucket of new development, which is costly and very market sensitive on commodity prices and building prices, along with your reference to design styles. So to some of the aspects of, a larger perspective of new development is, trying at the moment at the ground level to work with what we have already as an existing stock and then evaluating how to utilize, very easy sources to start the ball rolling to show improvement or target areas of need.
Yep, that sounds right. I think, the other thing too, like when you think about rehabbing existing units or repurposing, perhaps even repurposing existing commercial structures that are underutilized, is, I think you need to think about what cities can practically do to bring down the costs of materials. So, if you can work regionally and purchase cooperatively with your neighbors across jurisdictional bounds some of the materials necessary for developers to try to bring down the costs for them as much as you can. That could be helpful. But also on the labor side, the labor is sort of a fixed price there, but the city can help move people into the home building field, right, by trying to work with developers.
Well, it's
and
difficult because
right?
there's no essence of an apprentice program in
Right.
construction any longer.
Right, there's
So,
not, and that's a gap that perhaps the local government can fill for the developer. And I think one of the things we saw too as a result of COVID, lots of communities set up basically a CARES fund where they put that they used to hold their coronavirus relief funds, but they also made these funds open to solicit, basically good corporate citizens could also, put in private dollars, donations to these funds. And I think, you could sort of make the case to people in your city, that, if stable housing is a prerequisite for job security and is a prerequisite for economic mobility or a prerequisite for health, that maybe your biggest health provider, your biggest employers would want to make contributions to a fund that would go toward housing stability because it would bring down healthcare costs. It would
Agreed.
create a more reliable labor market and that sort of thing.
I'd agree with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Sam, did you had your hand up? You're on mute. You're on mute, Sam.
You touched on a couple of the interests I had. One, in terms of creativity, do you have? I'm sure you may be aware of models of affordable housing designs. I think that's always one of the challenges. Also, when most people think about affordable housing that may be sponsored or supported by municipalities, they tend to think of large developments versus models that can sort of you can drop in, just fit into an existing neighborhood. I think that's something that might be might help the cause. I know of one or two models here in Columbia that I'm still bragging to people about as a possibility. So anything you guys have on that in terms of your experience around the country, I think would help some folks here. I'm kind of interested in the apprenticeship program also. If we're talking jobs, usually I think that may also be an incentive for future tenants in a affordable housing project. They sweat equity going into a project kind of opens the door for them. That would be interesting also, I think.
Yeah, I think I saw a member of Habitat was on your task force. So
right.
you have a great sweat equity resource right there. And you're absolutely right. I think, Lauren, you had a comment you were going to say.
Yeah, a community land trust could be a viable option in terms of creating affordability for home ownership as well as renters, as well as shared equity ownership. There's different models, which include community land trust, limited equity cooperatives. One of our partners now send the information to the councilwoman, Grounded Solution Network. They are really great at what they do, and they help cities across the country to implement community land trust that creates permanent affordability. And it's a single family house. It could be a duplex, a triplex, or a fourplex, not necessarily a huge development that you could potentially look into. And to also look at public land as to how this one-time investment can create lasting affordability.
Yeah, I think just thinking too about what you were saying about the different models, we have to be, careful that, when you're working inside distressed neighborhoods to revitalize it, housing alone isn't going to revitalize it. You can build lots of units, most cheaply in areas that are distressed, probably, right? But without a solid plan for connecting those residents to job opportunities, to good education opportunities, these sorts of things, childcare, ways to meet their health and nutrition needs. What you're really doing is just further concentrating poverty in one part of your city. And so you have to do both. You have to think about revitalizing distressed neighborhoods, but you really must work with residents to open up high performing neighborhoods to a broad array of residents from across your city. You got to think about sort of what are the obstacles there. That cities are responsible. Now, public opinion is its own obstacle, and you have to use the power of the pulpit to the best of your ability. But things like zoning and permitting and the whole sort of administrative regime there, should be examined. And perhaps you've taken steps to do that already. But there's always a chance you can do more. And I know that oftentimes there's universities or other partners like DAC that can assist with those kinds of activities.
Mike, I just had a quick follow-up question. When looked at the map, look, you had us as a transit desiring city. Can you explain what y'all mean by that? I think I know, but I want to make sure.
Lauren, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, a transit desiring city, meaning that connections in terms of getting residents to and from job connected.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think you have good jobs. It's just a question of, do your residents have an opportunity to get to them?
Okay, yeah. I think we all would agree with that. Mr. Ando is head of our transit authority. I don't think he made it on the call, but he is a member of the task force. So I want to make sure I have that. Okay, guys, that's kind of our time, unless someone has a burning question for Mike and Lauren, because I want to, Dr. Grady has some information as a follow-up on a discussion we had last month. So I want to get to him and still get you guys out in time. Does anybody have any pressing questions for Mike or Lauren? Just jump in. Sue?
Yeah, I just was really interested, Lauren, you mentioned about mediation between tenants and landlords. And, one of the things that we know works well is housing court, not just to try to get representation for tenants, but also it seems to mitigate the amount of evictions that are taking place, because eviction no longer becomes a collection action. There is an actual dialogue. And I was wondering, when you're talking about mediation, is that in conjunction with housing court, or how, where have you seen some successful programs that have worked as a way to implement to mitigate eviction?
Yeah, it's a yes and no. In some cases, it is connected to housing court, but depending on how the local courts are set up, if there is an actual court dedicated to housing. In terms of example, Pittsburgh is rolling out a mediation program right now where they're partnering with legal aid clinics and lawyers and trying to help to bring down evictions. Greensboro, North Carolina is another excellent example of what they're doing in terms of mediation, as well as Philadelphia. Which is interesting is that Philadelphia is not working with the courts to do their mediation, but right now National League of Cities in Stanford is trying to broker a relationship between the courts so that it can be a streamlined process. But it could be either or, depending on the situation, as to how, when looking at creating a mediation program, kind of like your task force, who all needs to be at the table to make this program more effective.
Thank you, Lauren. Sue is really big and interested on evictions, and I'm not sure if those of you guys on the task force saw, I guess as the report came out in the last couple of days about the number of evictions that we expect to see here in South Carolina in the next 4 months, and it's a staggering number. as a result of COVID and other things. So.
And Sue, feel free to reach out to me if you have any lingering questions. I'm working with the Stanford Legal Design Research Lab, and they do research. So if you have a question, please follow up. And
thank you. I will.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, Mike and Lauren, thank you so much for being here. Y'all are welcome to stay on to see the next part if you want to, but if you've got something else to do, we certainly understand. Task force members, I do have a copy of their PowerPoint that Erica will send out to you guys after this meeting, and then you also have the whole Homeward Bound report. So anyway, thank you guys.
All right, thank you.
All right, Brian, if you would go ahead. So last month, after Lee's presentation, which was amazing, and kudos to Lee and Krista and whole staff, council unanimously approved Columbia Compass with no questions, which is amazing for us. And so we appreciate that. But someone had the question, I think either Jeff or Jim had a question just about kind of do we know where affordable units are? And at that time, I mentioned to you guys that we had an offer out to somebody to serve on the task force from State Housing, but we were waiting for the chain of command to get the approval. But Dr. Grady was who we've been talking to, and so he's been watching our meetings. And he emailed and said, I have the answer. And within a day or two, we actually got the answer that he was approved to be on the task force. So we'll welcome him as a new member, but also as a presenter to kind of to present some of his research regarding the affordability in the Midlands. So Brian, I'm gonna just let you take it away at that point.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. I was gonna say, great presentation from the National League of Cities there. I certainly on board with almost everything that they said, and a lot of it is actually recommendations that we at SD Housing made in sort of the concluding remarks to our housing needs assessment, which I'll get into a little bit. The other piece is I know that Councilwoman sent out the email about the South Carolina Housing Forum, which starts today at 2, and I'm speaking at that as well about some related topics, some additional things that go into how housing fits into the broader picture. And yeah, the eviction numbers you mentioned in particular are harrowing, looking at a majority of renters in South Carolina being at risk of eviction this year. 273,000, I think it is, households. Just a mind-boggling number. But this talk in particular, as mentioned, is a little bit more focused on sort of what the, a little bit of the findings from our housing needs assessment, but specifically on this question of subsidized housing. So let me go ahead and pop this open here. All right. And okay, excellent. So as mentioned, just a quick discussion about housing needs and subsidized housing availability here in Columbia and the Midlands at large. So there we go. All right, so as mentioned, SC Housing, we go by that because the real name on there is long. We're a state agency. We've been here almost half a century now to serve the housing needs of low and moderate income residents of our state. We have home ownership programs. We have rental development programs, rental assistance and compliance programs, our housing trust fund home repair program, a lot of different moving parts. The important thing that I mentioned there is we do not receive general fund appropriations. We are self-financing, so that has its pluses and minuses. And our mission, quite simply, is to provide create quality, affordable housing opportunities for the citizens of South Carolina. So, as mentioned, the housing needs assessment. That was sort of job one when I was brought in by our executive director, Benita Shropshire, to come in and do an assessment. We hadn't had one in South Carolina since 2002, so that was developed last year. You see the website there for the full report. There's also an appendix. There's also county and congressional district fact sheets about housing conditions. The reason why the needs assessment was so important, first off, was for our internal consumption. How do we design evidence-based programs? How do we stretch the resources that we have how do we be good stewards of public funds? And then the second piece of it is presentations like this, quite frankly. How do we better inform public, private, and nonprofit stakeholders about what the landscape looks like when it comes to housing affordability and availability? So there were 6 sort of key conclusions from the needs assessment. The fourth one is bolder because I'm going to talk about that more than the others. But 1 out of every 4 renters in South Carolina severely cost burdened. And I should say, because this was published last year, this is pre-pandemic numbers, which means these figures are probably going to get worse in the short run. The average renter can't afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment in almost every county statewide. Extremely high eviction rate, which we'll get into. Only enough subsidized rental units to serve 1 in 5 low-income renter households. Homelessness, obviously a major issue affecting thousands of South Carolinians on a nightly basis. And shelter poverty, which I'll describe in more detail. 32% of households in South Carolina fell into that category, and it has an $8.4 billion drag on the state's economy every year. So how do these apply to Richland County, the Midlands, and Columbia more specifically? So you'll see here a little over the state average. 27.6% of renters spend most of their income on housing and utilities in Richland County. So their rent or their mortgage payment plus basic utilities are a majority of their income. Obviously, if you're in that condition, your ability to afford other essentials, let alone try to save money or anything like that, are severely restricted. That comes out to 16,870 households in the county. And 79% of the county's extremely low income households are severely cost burdened. And you can see what extremely low income is. And there's a reason it's called extremely low income. These are people who are basically making poverty wages. And not surprisingly, given rent structures, vast majority of those individuals are severely cost burdened. Renter wage gap. So this is data from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. This was recently updated. There's basically an issue where the average renter can't afford to rent, quite frankly. So if you look at these numbers, the average renter in Richland County makes $14.54. In Lexington County, it's about 12 and change. But in the Columbia area, it costs $17.90 an hour to afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment at HUD fair market rent. So that's, when I say basic, I mean, a lower quality than average apartment in the Midlands. If you are working full-time every week, every month, you have to make $17.90 to afford that. And the average renter doesn't, let alone people who are making less than the average renter. So you can see that there's that gap of $3.36. And in Lexington County, again, that's $5 and change. With regard to evictions, it's harrowing numbers. They were harrowing numbers before, and they are likely to be even more harrowing numbers as a result of the pandemic. In Richland County, there were 114 court-ordered evictions in 2016 for every 1,000 renters. So about 1 in 9 renters were evicted, and that's compared to the state average of 89. And you say, oh, well, state average is 89. That's dramatically worse than any other state in the country. The second highest was Virginia at 51. So South Carolina has an extremely high eviction rate to start with, let alone now with so many low-wage renters having seen their wages disrupted as a result either of businesses closing or decreased demand for things like hospitality and tourism work. City of Columbia specifically, the eviction rate was 82 per 1,000 renters, which was the 8th highest eviction rate of any city with over 100,000 people in the entire country. And obviously, if the county number was 114 and the city number was 82, that's because either in neighboring suburbs or unincorporated areas, these are census designated places, the rates were particularly harrowing. St. Andrews had the highest eviction rate in the country for any mid-sized place between 20 and 100,000 people. So evictions, as mentioned, a serious problem before, now a full-blown crisis. With respect to homelessness, the point-in-time count, which is essentially, I'm sure some of you on this call know better than I do, essentially send volunteers out to count people who are experiencing homelessness, whether they're in the shelter or on the streets. Last year, that number was 851 in Richland County. but that's a substantial undercount for a wide variety of reasons. Sort of a more reliable number, in my opinion, although it's probably still a substantial undercount, is the data that are collected by school districts. Under the federal McKinney-Vento law, they have to report to the State Department of Education individuals who are homeless or otherwise housing insecure, living in hotels, staying with relatives, things like that, not having a permanent residence. There were 1,300 students in between Richland 1 and Richland 2 that fell into that category in the 2016-17 school year. So there are, statewide is about 1 in 60. So one kid out of every 2 or 3 classrooms in South Carolina doesn't have a permanent place to live, which is, again, a stark number. So with respect to shelter poverty, to try to explain this in quickly, this is sort of my original research contribution to the needs assessment, backed up by some peer-reviewed work that I've done. But essentially, it combines federal data with a report commissioned by the United Way Association called the Self-Sufficiency Standard. Basically allows you to estimate what the, basically if you take somebody's income and you take what they're paying toward housing, is what's left enough to afford all of their other essential expenses, whether that's transportation, healthcare, food, clothing, the basics. These are, for very complicated reasons, they're calculated by public use microdata area. One of them sort of kind of lines up with the city boundary, so I went ahead and pulled that data. So you can see there are 3 census tracts in Richland County where at least part of it is within the city limits. So you see what that looks like on the map there. Almost 77,000 households, and about 28,000 of them are experiencing shelter poverty. So 36.4% of households in Columbia and adjacent areas is in that condition of shelter poverty. That comes out to a total affordability gap of over $450 million. So that is the amount of sort of deprivation that is experienced that has to be picked up by either public assistance or private charity or people simply doing without what they need to live. It also is the economic drag on the city of Columbia because there's not enough affordable housing. If people could all live affordably, there would be that much more consumer activity in the city, which is a sort of a jaw-dropping number. And that comes out to a drag over $2,000 per person in this area. So that was just a quick overview of the findings from the needs assessment. I wanted to dig a little deeper on this question of subsidized housing because this came up last month. To speak about what this looks like. So in Richland County, there are 21 subsidized rental units for every 100 low-income renters county-wide. That's slightly better than the state average of 20. So when I'm talking about subsidized units, that means HUD, whether that's traditional public housing or project-based Section 8 or other sorts of federal assistance through them. Not an issue in the city of Columbia, obviously, but USDA rural development also fits into this. There's programs that the Department of Agriculture runs. And then our stuff, low-income housing tax credit properties that are largely financed by SC Housing. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about this universal subsidized rental units. This data is pulled from the National Housing Preservation Database, which kind of tries to pull all this together. What that means is over 30,000 renter households who could qualify for project-based assistance. They are low-income renters, and depending on the program, most if not all low-income renters qualify for them, but the units aren't there. Now, this does not include housing choice vouchers, but on the other hand, also housing choice voucher residents typically will live in other forms of subsidized housing, particularly tax credit housing, because LIHTC projects are required to accept vouchers and many private landlords choose not to do so, as discussed in the previous presentation. And that number of subsidized rental units per 100 is actually substantially lower across the river in Lexington County, where there's only 12 subsidized rental units per 100 low-income renters. And so here's what this looks like by local entities. You've got the 10 largest municipalities in the Midlands plus the census designated places in Richland and Lexington County. So you see there, according to the best estimate, it is an estimate, there are just over 6,000 subsidized units within the city of Columbia across those different programs that I mentioned. But there are over 16,000 low-income renters, and that's renters who are making less than 80% of the area median is the formal definition there. So that ratio comes out to 37. So that's better than the county at large, but obviously still means that most low-income renters do not have subsidized housing available to them. So you see that gap there of over 10,000 units that are potentially needed. And you can see how that breaks out by municipality. A lot of the close neighbors, West Columbia, Casey, Irmo, Forest Acres, are serving only a tiny fraction, or in the case of Forest Acres, not serving any of their low-income renters with subsidized housing. Certainly you hear a lot of when people speak about the fear of affordable housing, they talk about, oh, well, low-income people are going to move into my neighborhood. Well, the fact is they're already in the neighborhood. They're just not able to access housing that they can afford. And they struggle in many cases to live near where their jobs are located. And you can see what that looks like for the census designated places. It's a very similar story. There's very little affordable housing available to serve the population. And then geographically, here's what this looks like. I do have a spreadsheet, but obviously I wasn't going to put a spreadsheet in a PowerPoint presentation. But this is, these are where the affordable housing properties are located in the Richland and Lexington County area. And you can see the city in that sort of tan color. I hope that shows up okay on your end. But you can see where those are located, and they're certainly disproportionately located in distressed neighborhoods. Some of these include some of the properties have actually been torn down, but they're still in the HUD database, so they're still showing up as being situated there. So you can see what that looks like. You can see it's disproportionately in those distressed communities. Not a lot of affordable housing in the suburbs, quite frankly, or the more well-developed areas of Columbia. So if you're looking at, okay, so how much, if the question is what needs to happen on a numerical front to quantify this need, there's actually a pretty robust answer to that. The HUD puts out something called the Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy data set. It's unfortunately a bit dated. There's a lot of lag in getting the numbers out, but it is probably the most frequent way that local governments sort of evaluate, well, if you have to put a number on it, how many units need to be built? This is sort of the go-to. So it takes data from the American Community Survey and sorts it into those income tiers that I've been talking about: extremely low income, very low income, low income, and is able to describe the conditions experienced by those households. So, if you had to put a bare minimum estimate of what needs to be built or rehabilitated or preserved in terms of affordable housing resources, well, you've got 570 low-income renters that are living in substandard or severely overcrowded housing. And what that means is they literally do not have full kitchen or plumbing. So they don't have a sink or a fridge or a toilet or something like that, like basic living. Or severely overcrowded means that there are over 1.5 people per room in the house or apartment. So overcrowded to the point of being a severe health concern. There are 570 renters renter households that fit that description in the city of Columbia. And then you tack onto that extremely low income renters that are severely cost burdened. So that's the people, $20,000 or less for a family of four, who are spending a majority of their income on rent and utilities. That's $4,550. So you put those together, you got a number slightly above 5,000. Which is about 9% of the total housing units in the city of Columbia. And again, this is sort of the people who are in the most dire circumstances. As I mentioned, there was the number of over 10,000 if you're talking about a shortage of subsidized housing relative to the need of low-income renters. And again, this is data from I believe 2012 to 2016. Like I said, there's a bit of a lag. So this is obviously pre-pandemic numbers. This is dating back to when the economy was at least in better shape than it is today. So a couple concluding remarks, and a lot of this is going to sound familiar from the last presentation, but the one thing that my boss, Director Shropshire, mentioned when we put this report out is it's the beginning of a conversation. Our resources are limited. Even if we spent every dollar perfectly, we could not fix this even in Columbia, let alone the rest of the state, quite frankly. It's going to take state government, it's going to take local government, it's going to take nonprofits, it's going to take private sector, and obviously the federal government has a role to play as well. Local governments play a crucial role. Again, these sorts of questions you just heard. Are there excess regulations preventing needed housing development? Can the city's workforce afford to live in the city? Does the available housing stock match its population? One of the statistics I kind of throw at people that it often surprises them. The percentage of households that are families with children is less than 30% of the state of South Carolina. People have this idea that's got to be the majority, right? That's where I grew up, and I grew up in this neighborhood that had all these families. Well, that's not common anymore. There's a lot of households that are single people. There's a lot of households that are empty nest couples. It's sort of a question of does the housing stock that exists match the people that want to live there? And obviously speaking for SC Housing, we're happy to partner with anybody. We have an open door policy. Things are a little complicated because we're scoring funding applications, so we obviously can't say everything. But we're eager to work. We're here to assist this task force and other communities across the state. So what can be done? Again, a lot of this we just heard. Support construction of more housing, particularly in areas of high demand for housing or near job centers. And the one thing I highlight is it can reduce traffic. If people can walk or bike or take a bus from point A to point B, that's one less car on the roads. And obviously that's a huge political, flashpoint, I guess. Create new and bolster existing sources of funding for long-term housing affordability, like housing trust funds. Greenville Housing Fund is certainly the preeminent local example here in South Carolina. You heard about community land trusts in the presentation. Speak up for housing first approaches. Again, there's probably people on this call who can speak to that better than I can, but it helps stabilize vulnerable individuals. And the one thing that is a little crass but needs to be said is there are a lot of studies. There's been studies in Charlotte and a lot of other places that show that it's actually less expensive to provide housing to someone who has been experiencing homelessness and just give them a place to live and supportive services and stabilize them than it is to do nothing, because of the added costs that are imposed on criminal justice system, on the healthcare system, on all of the other social services that are affected by someone who doesn't have a place to live. Again, eviction mediation and alternatives to court ordered removal, educating renters about their legal rights. Obviously, Ms. Berkowitz can wax poetic on that. And then the last piece is legislative. So one thing that happened here in South Carolina is in May, legislature approved and the governor signed House Bill 3998, which allows us, which provides for a state tax credit that provides matching funds for the federal low-income housing tax credit. So we were obviously supportive of that and certainly grateful that, and it passed by a wide margin, bipartisan support. So it was not a knockdown, drag out kind of thing. But one of the things that we're highlighting is the things pointed out by our trade group, the National Council of State Housing Agencies. Because of the pandemic, there needs to be some rental assistance provided by the federal government. There needs to be, one of the things we're advocating for is a housing assistance fund, which, if you're familiar with SC Help, would sort of provide the funds for us to reboot that, because we ran out of money several years ago on that front. And then also shoring up the affordable housing, low-income housing tax credit, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, and the National Homes Investment Act, which Senator Scott is a co-sponsor of, that would redirect investment to distressed communities to improve the single-family housing infrastructure. So there's a lot there, and I probably am way over my time. So I'd be happy to take any questions, and you can certainly follow up with me later. There's my contact information. So Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And we do have a few more minutes, but I know some people might have to drop off. So if you do, go ahead and do that. We'll make sure we get information. I do have two questions, and then I'll see if anybody else has any. I just wanted clarity on two things. So Brian, when you came up with the number, you said at minimum 5,000, but when you flash back to the previous slide where you had everybody listed, you had a difference of 10,000 units for Columbia. Can you reconcile those two numbers for me?
Sure. So the 5,000 plus number is essentially looking at the people who are in the greatest degree of distress, the people who are living in overcrowded or substandard housing, and those people at 30% AMI or less who are severely cost burdened. So that larger 10,000 number is basically looking at how many low-income renters are there and how many subsidized units are there. It's not necessarily the case that every low-income renter is cost burdened or severely cost burdened. Certainly a lot of them are, but some of them have housing that is at least satisfactory and affordable. So that's why that you have this smaller 5,000 number that is sort of the worst case needs. And then you have this broader gap of a little over 10,000 renters overall who could qualify for subsidized housing, but the units aren't available.
Okay. And then my second question to you was, when you did the cost of housing, and I guess the difference, you had the median was like $14 and something, but then they should be making 17. And y'all correct me, but in minimum wage is like 7.
$7.25, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess the question I'm asking is, I know that folks advocate for a living wage and a more increase in the minimum wage, but really, in order for someone to live here in the Midlands, we know it'll be more costly to live in Columbia than it would be somewhere else. But to live in Columbia, really, we should be looking at folks to make at least $15 an hour is what we need, or is it that $17?
Well, that's for a 2-bedroom apartment. Now, obviously, not everyone needs a 2-bedroom apartment necessarily, but obviously, anybody who has children or a family is going to need more space. The comparable number for a 1-bedroom is about $15 in terms of, and that's if you work literally 40 hours a week, every week, no vacations, no breaks, no time off. And that's based on this sort of rule of thumb of 30% of your income. You shouldn't spend more than 30% of your income on rent or mortgage and utilities, which is sort of just a back of the envelope estimate. It's essentially a number that Congress picked in 1981 that we all just kind of ran with. So that sort of was the motivation behind that shelter poverty analysis that I showed. But yeah, without getting into making an official statement on wage policy, quite frankly, $7.25 an hour is certainly far from being able to afford even the most basic housing in Columbia. Yes.
And I was just asking, and Sue or Jennifer might have a comment on that, but when we do get into our committee work in the education committee, all the, housing, of course, related to housing is income. And so that might be something that we need to discuss as far as, either a position on the $15 minimum wage or something. So I just throw that out there. But thank you. Other questions, guys, for Brian?
Brian, would you make your PowerPoint available to us?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I'll make sure Erica sends that out.
Yeah, that's right. I already sent a copy. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
I have a question. Based on conversion ratios from renters to homeowners, I know the SC Housing offers down payment assistance programs and things like that. Is there any number on, I don't know, whether there's a period of time of 5 years, 10 years of a conversion ratio from maybe being a low-income renter to a low-income purchaser, going through the SC Housing buying program? Is there any number on that? Like a conversion ratio?
That's a good question. Certainly I would say that, unfortunately, because of limited income mobility, because of limited wages, we certainly that's certainly our goal is that people who are in our low income housing, if they want to become homeowners, that they can hopefully get to that point. But that's a function of not just housing, that's a function of economic and workforce development is a function of a lot of issues. Getting a reliable number on that at even the state level, let alone the local level, would be challenging. But I'd be happy to speak with you at more length and see if I can find anything that sort of speaks to that specific question.
Yeah, I was just curious because a lot of people, say that, a lot of realtors market, it's cheaper to own than rent. And I just wondered if there was any way to, the success rate of someone moving from low income renting to low income ownership, because there are homes that are under 150 available. Not many, but not many at all. Trust me, I know. But just wondering if there was any kind of tracking of any progress.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly is. It's well documented. There's obviously been a shortage of housing construction since 2008, and particularly, as mentioned by the previous presentation, they tend to stick with what they know, and that's usually large suburban single-family homes or apartment buildings. Those are sort of your templates. So finding, there's not a lot of people building a lot of starter homes, so there's going to be a lot of price pressure there at the bottom of the homeownership market. And yes, we do have down payment assistance. We have a number of programs that are designed to help, but they still have to meet credit standards. They still have to meet underwriting requirements. So there's certainly some hurdles there.
Anybody else have a question for Brian?
Yeah, this is Dylan Gunnels.
Dylan, I'm sorry, and I didn't get you to, can you start also by introducing yourself because you're a new member?
Sure. My name's Dylan Gunnels. I spend my life in ministry and nonprofit world. That's the easiest way to put it. Specifically with this group, I'm representing Mutual Aid of the Midlands, which is a group of connected volunteers, really helping to navigate issues that our community members are facing, specifically related to the pandemic. And majority of what we are assisting people with or having conversations related to is housing. So this was important for us to be a part of the discussion, and I'm excited for what we're hearing. And so that kind of leads into my question, because we are preparing ourselves for the amount of evictions that could be coming and how we're advocating for those people. We've already been advocating for some folks who have been facing eviction already. And so when you mention the staggering amount of eviction rates that happen in our state alone, and then what could be coming from the pandemic, I guess I'm looking to understand, is the answer to this question a both and, or is there one side that's more impactful than the other? Is it the financial situations of the individuals, or is it also kind of the ease of the legislative processes and the I guess the legal rights that tenants have? Because it seems to me in the state of South Carolina, it's really easy to evict people and go through those processes, and it's more of a scare tactic to get people to the table. So I guess I'm asking if it's a both and, or if there's more of the financial situation or the legislative processes.
Well, I mean, specific to the pandemic, I mean, looking at the estimates, like I said, there's a consulting firm called Stout that's sort of the source of well, it's the number that's most terrifying, but it's a number that's well defended of 52% of South Carolina renters being at risk. Now, that's toward the top nationally, but there are obviously plenty of other states that have, a different set of landlord-tenant laws that are also obviously facing a massive issue. But you look at the numbers historically. You look at the 2016 data from the Eviction Lab, and it shows that South Carolina was the worst in the country under at least better economic conditions. So I think the short answer is it is both, and that it is affecting South Carolina and Columbia, sort of from both ends of this, where there's a massive loss of, this massive loss of income for all of these low wage workers who are in the service industry, who were, many of their businesses were closed down or they saw reduced demand. So certainly that's a national thing, and that's probably if you had to split that 52% number, that's larger half. elevated eviction rate to start with, and that there's certainly, without providing legislative recommendations as somebody who works for an executive agency, there's certainly a question of whether whether the balance between landlord and tenant rights and responsibilities is in the right spot. So I hope that answers your question. But
yeah, that does. And I think it'll take more digging. I'm going to email you for sure.
Okay.
All right, we're down to like our last couple of minutes. So I'm going to dispense with the discussion on the task force mission and the committee formation, just to see if anybody had any other questions for Brian or any last minute comments. I'll take some input from you guys, but I really maybe next month. I know I got the committee stuff very late, so I know not all committees got a chance to meet. But I think next month we really need to kind of have more discussion, because you guys have a lot of knowledge and expertise in this area, and we know our challenge is really big, and it's gotten bigger because of the pandemic, and so we really need to start getting into some working items. So next month, I want to have more of a discussion instead of just giving presentations to you guys, but I hope that these presentations at least will frame the work that we're going through. But does anybody have any comments or any other questions before we close out?
Yes, Councilmember Devine, John Ando here. Hi, sorry my delay.
And that's okay. Erica texted me. The only thing that kind of came up about you, I think we all know, is just transportation is a challenge. And so that's one of the things that NLC has identified us as what we already knew as a transit desiring city. So do need to have some discussions around transit and those needs as well. But yes, sir, go ahead.
One thing I just want to add on that is one concern that I want to see what we can do to mitigate is the affordability of transit. As the cost of living goes up, cost of housing goes up, transportation is a huge cost for low-income residents. And if there's creative solutions that we can work to reduce that cost, since transportation is a need for especially those that are low income, such as fare-free transit, CDBG funded subsidized transit passes for those that are living in lower subsidized housing, is one solution that perhaps we can look into. One question I wanted to add is, ask is, you mentioned about $15 minimum wage. Is this something that the city potentially is looking at, maybe having a minimum wage for the city to help increase the revenue generated by low-income residents to afford housing?
So no, not the city, but so you can correct me if I'm wrong. I know that there has been, I think maybe Representative Brawley has introduced legislation, but I know there's been talk on the state. It hasn't gone really anywhere, but I know that there are some legislators who would like South Carolina to look at increasing the minimum wage. So do you have something to add?
Yeah, no, there's been a lot of efforts. I mean, even trying to get a $1 increase has been really, really difficult. I don't think it's a problem with the majority of our legislative delegation, but until there's a different critical mass up at the State House, that's going to be difficult. And the other piece that's difficult is a number of years ago, there was actually preemption language that had been put into the state law as to what cities and states can do. I mean, cities, municipalities, and counties can do, and whether they can do anything independently. And Councilwoman Devine, I don't know if y'all have looked at that or not, but that passed over 10 years ago. I think that that's something there's going to have to be an effort to undo to make sure that home rule, not that anybody's challenged it yet, but it might be that it would take a municipality doing a challenge on that.
Yeah.
So basically what you're saying is that, like in California, for instance, how cities and counties can have a separate minimum wage apart from the state and the federal government. Is that allowable in South Carolina or no?
I don't think it is. At least you cannot put it in your contracts or you can't mandate it from private businesses, but back when that was done, it was to limit municipalities and counties from putting it in their contracts with potential vendors. So I don't, I haven't looked at it to see if a way around it would be just saying everybody should get that, but I have a feeling it's probably prohibits it.
Yeah, that's been our discussion. I don't know, Patrick, our one of our city attorneys is on. I don't know if Patrick has a different thought, but the last time we talked about it as a group about 5 years ago, we were told we were preempted. We are internally looking at our staff and incrementally increasing. We pay a living wage, but we do want to go up. And so I think that's all we have the ability to do. Patrick, you want to add something?
Yeah, well, if we're preempted, there really is nothing we could do except for encourage the legislators to change the law. Because if we're limited by state law, then that means we can't really do anything about it.
That's what I was afraid. That's what I understood.
Yeah. So,
sorry.
But we can certainly advocate, and I think that the power of this task force is understanding how all these issues relate, from homelessness to transit to affordable wages. All these things are related. And so I think the power of us is we all have our constituencies who can be the advocates for the folks at the State House and others. So that's why I brought it up. I think that's definitely something, as we talk about our action plan and what we want to do, those are some things that we need to consider. Okay. All right, guys, I've gotten you over by 3 minutes, so I'm sorry about that. Is there any quick last minute comments or questions or even announcements that anybody's working on? Nope. Okay. Allison, are you still on? I think she's gone. Councilwoman Horatio was on, and she was texting me as well. Just remember, guys, although this is the city's task force, we've got a great advocate. We've got several, but we've got a great advocate on county council who's going to be part of all of our discussions. So we need to think this is really the Midlands. This isn't about the city of Columbia specific, but this is the Midlands. And I think it's showing that what Brian put up regarding, what Columbia has versus every other city and area in the Midlands, we see that we've got to understand that we got to work together to make sure that everybody in the Midlands is addressed, not just the folks if you're a resident of the city. So,
Councilwoman, I'm sorry.
Gloria. Hey.
I was trying to find my unmute button. I apologize. In fact, I really enjoyed the meeting. The presentations were excellent. But before we go, I do want everybody on the call to know that the City of Columbia's Community Development Department is holding a public hearing on tomorrow in regards to our 5-year con plan and annual action plan. It's a substantial amendment on how we're going to use our CDBG COVID dollars. So those of you who are on the call, if you haven't received notification, we'd love you to participate and ask questions in terms of what we're planning. Please contact me. You can email me and I can make sure that you get that notification.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. All right. Well, all hearts and minds are clear, y'all. Our next meeting is September 8th at 11. In the interim, you should expect to hear from your committee chair if you haven't already, and start meeting. For those folks who have not told me what committee, I will personally ping you and say, hey, where do you want to serve? The legal committee is just me and Sue right now. So if I know that some folks might feel like, oh, I'm not law, but all this stuff, like we're talking about the minimum wage, zoning. I know we have a zoning committee, and we might think about combining those two committees, Sue. But but if anybody wants to serve, please let us know. But until then, thank you guys for your service. Thank you for your time, and give me a call in the interim if y'all need anything. Okay. All right.